So we're going to talk about the SensIT. There's a couple different versions. We have the SensIT Gold and the G2. Some of the buttons and the tick sound indicators are a little bit different, but for the most part, they're all the same. So they do have a pump, and on these, the sensor is actually located inside, and we put an extra filter on the top just to make sure that everything stays out of there and it stays clean. So when it comes to the SensIT, it measures LEL of methane, and that's what it's calibrated for. So when we look here at the chart, this is the methane and air chart of the percentages. So right here at 5%, that is the lower explosive limit of methane. So when you have 5% of methane mixed with air, it can actually ignite, cause a fire, explode. And 15% is the upper explosive limit. And so once it gets past 15%, it's too rich to burn and nothing will happen. So that 5 to 15% is what we're really worried about. When we look at what the SensIT measures, it actually measures the spot up to 5%. So when you get to 100% LEL on your monitor, that is when it can ignite, explode, and we don't know how much there is once you hit 100% on the SensIT. It's somewhere past this point or right at that point, but we have to treat it all the same. Our policies and procedures show at 10% is where we mark the exclusion zone, and we use PPE. And that's because we don't know if air shifts or if rooms or doors get opened, we could actually go up to that 100% pretty quickly. Next, we're going to talk about the parts per million on the SensIT itself. So it starts out with parts per million. It's a very, very small amount. And when it gets to about 2,000 parts per million, it'll switch over to a percentage, which is around 2% is what it'll show when it switches over. So there's not a set number that we've seen where it actually switches. The other thing that's going to be on your SensIT is a CO monitor. And so make sure that you know when you look at the labels, you'll see an X because there's no sensor in these spots for these gases. So when you look at the sensor, make sure that it correlates to what's next to it. The SensIT will show parts per million for methane next to the EX, not the CO. So we also need to make sure that we don't use this in just any flammable atmosphere because it can only detect certain ones. It's really good at detecting certain things like freon, leaks from AC units, for methane, for hydrogen. However, it won't be accurate with those other chemicals. Also, just because it's flammable doesn't mean that the SensIT will actually pick it up. If we're worried about a flammable atmosphere, we need to use the multi-ray because it has a different LEL sensor that will detect any flammable atmosphere. When we compare the SensIT to the multi-ray, it has two completely different LEL sensors. So this one will actually react very fast when you go to detect some methane or other type of gas that it can detect. And the multi-ray takes time for it to actually get through and process. Also, because this is a metal oxide sensor and this isn't, they won't necessarily look the same. So if you show up and you have 50% on this, this may not reflect 50%, but know that they are both still working correctly. Also, make sure that you don't just use this in a flammable atmosphere, these work together. So this one will be able to pick up anything in a flammable atmosphere because the sensor that it uses actually burns what's flammable in the air. This one, because it's a metal oxide sensor, will not necessarily pick up certain flammable materials. It will pick up methane really well. It'll also pick up freon and hydrogen and multiple other things, but no, it won't pick up everything.